But first, let's talk about, again, what's happening in Canberra right now. Now, still waiting for a final vote on the censoring of the internet. This is about the government shutting down your capacity to post what you want to on your social media feeds. Oh, they say it's all about mis and disinformation, but you know the reality of what they're trying to shut off here. Now, the Senate will vote on that. No plan today. They come back next week. Presumably this thing will get killed off next week. Or if they're stupid enough, they will keep the door open, and an active part of the campaign leading into the next federal election will be that the Labor Party and the Greens want to censor the internet and everyone else doesn't. That'll be a major issue. It's up to Labor whether they kill it off or whether they bring it to the heart of our election, which will be a very bad news story for them. But today, the Prime Minister trying to distract from what is going to be this inevitable defeat of his attempt to censor adults on the internet, and we're turning towards trying to keep kids away from social media. Now, I've said for years that social media is poison. It is poison for way too many adults, and that poison should not be extended to children. Apart from what they see, the capacity for bullies to message you in the middle of the night, for people to gang up on you in a digital way, means that the problems that you and I felt when we went to school, well, they extend home, and it means there's a 24/7 cycle of, among other things, that is bullying. Now, today, the federal government introduced its laws to ban people under the age of 16 being able to have accounts on all of the obvious social media sites. Here's the Prime Minister saying why it's good.
As a government, we have a responsibility to keep our young Australians safe. We know that social media is causing social harm.
There was also some confusion about whether people under the age of 16 will be able to access YouTube. They will, because YouTube is not going to be included in this. Now, it wasn't just about access to YouTube. It was about whether your kid can have a YouTube account. To be honest, I have no idea why anyone under the age of 16, their parent would allow them to have it, but that is not going to be affected by the ban. Elon Musk taking time out from slashing things in the American budget, launching rockets, creating electric cars that lefties are now oh so happy that they drive around the cities. He responded to the Prime Minister today that it seems like a backdoor way to control access to the internet by all Australians. So obviously he doesn't want this thing to take place. Now, regardless of whether you think this is a great idea, a maybe idea or a bad idea, process matters. When we are talking about something as big and as serious with all of its potential intended and unintended consequences, the way that generally the process works is because the government doesn't have a majority in the Senate. Now, they generally do once they get the Greens and the lefties on the crossbench, but they don't have the outright numbers, which means that any piece of legislation as controversial as this is normally sent off to a committee. Now, I want you to have a listen to Channel 9 and how they're going to explain how the next part of this process works. Put simply, the government would like sooner rather than later to pass this legislation before Parliament ends next week, because there's every chance Parliament won't come back at all. A perfect example, and Bronwyn Bishop mentioned this last night, about why the government might tell us they want to have a budget and tell us they want to have an election in May, is that politicians who aren't going to be coming back after the next election, people like Bill Shorten, are giving their farewell speeches now. Now, he's supposed to be doing that in February. Parliament could be back in February, unless, of course, there's a plan for no Parliament to come back in February, which is why he gave his farewell address today, even though next week Parliament still continues. But have a listen to the review process. Now, think about how big this is. This is about limiting kids' access to social media and, as Elon Musk suggests, the potential complicating factors around all of it. Does this sound like a government who cares at all what anyone else thinks about these laws?
In an attempt to pass the laws before the end of next week, the bill has been referred to a quick 5-day committee for scrutiny. With only 24 hours given for submissions, tech companies are concerned the laws are being rushed without proper consultation.
This is pretty wild, right? So what you're seeing there is that tomorrow is the 24-hour period that if anyone wants to respond, from Elon Musk to you or me, to have our say on this piece of legislation, you've got to do it by tomorrow. Now, anyone who knows how to interact with government or put a submission forward for government, it's not just like banging out an email, it's slightly more complicated. The idea that they've issued a very narrow window and then just 5 days to have a look at the legislation, again, big tell that the government wants this done by the end of next week because, most likely, you can start to bet big that Parliament is not coming back. No budget, which means we may well be looking at a Prime Minister, and obviously I could well be proven wrong, but he could come as early as Australia Day and fire a starter's gun on an election into February or maybe into March. Any later than that, then obviously Parliament would have to come back. But all the little signs are showing us that it's an election sooner rather than later. But there's one thing I wanted to say about kids and their access to the internet. Now, I've shown you before that there are great documentaries that you should be watching with your tween and teen kids about the reality of social media, about how all of these companies actually work, about how it's a sort of digital version of a casino with artificial light, lots of stimulus, and the search for the stimulus is what makes you keep coming back, right? But as parents and grandparents, we play a role here. There is no 12-year-old in Australia who can buy a phone because they don't have any money. They don't have a job, which means they can't have the money to sign up and get a mobile phone. It is us, the parents, the family members or the grandparents, who are in charge of when they get access to their devices. Now, I am not going to pretend that I'm a person who has only had my kids play with wooden toys and, read intellectually approved books. My kids love mucking around on YouTube, and they will often sit with me and will giggle at some of the other stuff that's on the internet, but they do not have access to these devices without our knowledge. Please, if the parents of Australia could start to unite, and in all of those Facebook and WhatsApp groups that exist from kindergarten all the way through to year 12, before the kid can afford to buy a phone, let's decide the types of phones they can buy. Now, obviously, smartphones are things like your Samsung Galaxies or your iPhone 2018 or whatever it is right now. The other option is a thing called a dumb phone, which is a telephone only. It does not have access to the internet. It may or may not, hopefully not, have a camera, and you cannot access apps. If, for whatever reason, you think it's time for your kid or grandkid, niece, nephew or friend to have a phone, for goodness sake, make it a dumb one. Because ultimately, they can text you, you can text them, they can text their friends, but in the middle of the night, the apps are not going ding, ding, ding and monitoring them and trapping them into a world that in part is creating a scenario that, as I told you last night, kids as young as 8 now are showing serious signs of mental illness. That in part is being fueled by the garbage that they are being fed on the internet, and part of how they're being fed on it is by what their parents are letting them do. Now, I get it. There are certain age groups that will go off and find their own ways and are smarter with technology than their parents and potentially their grandparents. But the device they have is up to you. In the same way, you decide what you feed your kid for dinner. You can decide what devices they have in their pocket or you have in your home. Don't expect the government to do everything on this.